Hey there, sleepless rabble. Let me take over for a while. Tonight's story isn't about monsters in the woods or demons in the dark. It's about something quieter, something that lives behind picket fences and family photos. A man who hid behind Sunday prayers and Boy Scout badges. We're diving into the world of BTK, the so called perfect neighbor, a man who managed to fool an entire town, a church, even his own children. You'll hear about the suburban calm that covered a storm, the strange psychology of a man obsessed with rules, and the daughter who had to rebuild her world after discovering who her father really was. No gore, no sensationalism, just the chilling ordinariness of evil and the quiet aftermath it leaves behind. So, grab your blanket, settle in, and let's open with the only perspective that still aches. Hers. The first thing she remembers isn't the phone call. It's the silence that followed. The kind of silence that makes the air feel too heavy to breathe. Kerri Rawson was just living her life. The sort of life her father had always preached about. Church, community, responsibility. She'd grown up believing she had the blueprint for a good, safe existence. Until the blueprint tore itself in half. On that cold February day, 2005, she answered the phone and heard words that didn't make sense. Her father had been arrested for something so unthinkable that her mind refused to form the image. At first she laughed, the way people do when reality misfires. They had to be wrong. Her dad? The man who built a treehouse? Who prayed before every meal? Who still sent birthday cards with dad jokes inside? It was absurd. It was impossible. And yet, as the day unfolded, disbelief began to decay into dread. TV vans parked outside, journalists knocking, her father's name echoing across every channel, paired with stories too dark to repeat. That's when the ground beneath her life stopped feeling real. You see, Kerri had never been a daughter of a headline. She was a daughter of a church deacon, a husband, a father, a man whose lawn was always trimmed. Now, every memory was infected. Every bedtime story, every family trip. She scrolled through photo albums that suddenly looked like crime scenes. In the Netflix series about her life, you can see it. That hollow stare of someone trying to align two versions of the same man. One who taught her kindness, and one who taught the world fear. Her voice trembles when she says, "I didn't lose my father in 2005. I lost him the moment I realized who he'd always been." But we'll get to that part later. For now, imagine the stillness of her home that night. The way the refrigerator hum became deafening. The way every object in the house, his chair, his coffee mug, his Bible, became radioactive. The man she called Dad had existed in two dimensions. One for the world, one for himself. And she was standing in the ashes where those two realities finally collided. Alright, before we go any deeper, a quick pause, just between us. We know you hear it all the time. Like, subscribe, leave a comment. Honestly, we hate saying it too. It feels robotic, like we're all stuck in the same digital begging ritual. But here's the truth. Channels like this one don't exactly thrive on YouTube's good side. Our stories use words and themes that make the algorithm nervous. We can't tag things honestly. We can't describe them properly. So half the time, the video you're listening to right now is buried before anyone even sees it. That's why you matter more than you realize. When you like a video, when you subscribe, or even drop a tiny emoji in the comments, you're telling YouTube, hey, this weird little storytelling corner deserves to exist. It costs nothing, but it keeps us visible and motivated. Because otherwise, we write for hours, record, edit, polish, and the algorithm quietly tosses it into the void. So if you're willing to give us a hand, thank you. You're literally keeping Napmax alive. Alright, emotional blackmail over. Now, back to Kerri. When she finally saw her father's face on television, she didn't cry. She froze. Because it wasn't the face of a stranger. It was the same face that once tucked her in, told her to lock her doors, and promised, "You're safe here." The cruelest twist? She'd believed him. We all would have. Because monsters rarely look like monsters. Sometimes, they look like neighbors who wave from across the street. And sometimes, they look like Dad. Long before he was a husband, a church elder, or a headline, he was just a boy in Kansas. One of those quiet kids who followed every instruction to the letter. The kind teachers describe as well-behaved, while secretly wondering what's going on behind that stare. Dennis Rader grew up in the 1950s, when the world still felt black and white, when fathers fixed cars, mothers baked casseroles, and everyone smiled through their secrets. His childhood looked neat from the outside. Small town, strict parents, Sunday sermons. Inside, though, something else was taking root. He liked order. No, he needed it. Rules made him feel safe. He made lists for everything, of chores, schoolwork, even imaginary scenarios. And when he broke a rule, he didn't feel guilt. He felt curiosity. How much could he bend before someone noticed? There were early signs, the kind psychologists later underline in red. He was fascinated by the moment control shifted, by how power could change a room. He liked to tie things up. Toys, ropes, imaginary scenes in his mind. Nothing violent, not yet, just methodical. A rehearsal for something even he couldn't name. But the 1950s weren't the sort of era where you talked about impulses. Boys were told to man up. Emotions were furniture you didn't sit on. So Dennis learned to hide his inner world, and hide it well. Religion, too, played its part. The idea of sin thrilled and terrified him in equal measure. The more his church preached about purity, the more he thought about its opposite. Somewhere along the way, morality became a puzzle. Something to be managed, not felt. As a teenager, he looked normal enough. Tidy haircut, pressed shirts, polite manners. But he began to build a private universe made of rules only he understood. Everything needed structure, labels, procedure. Even his fantasies were filed in mental folders. When he got older, he joined the Air Force. The perfect place for a man obsessed with hierarchy and control. The discipline suited him, the uniforms comforted him, structure wrapped him like a second skin. But while he obeyed every order by day, his imagination wandered at night. Alone in the barracks, he kept journals of thoughts he couldn't share, about dominance, restraint, and the beauty of control. Psychologists later called it a paraphilic fixation. He called it organization. Back home, he married, got a job, bought a house, and mowed his lawn every Saturday, like everyone else. But that same mind that once catalogued chores now catalogued something darker. He began taking notes on strangers, habits, routines, patterns. His need for order had evolved into something else. A craving to design entire lives. To decide when they began and when they ended. If you'd met him then, you might have liked him. Most people did. He was polite, punctual, unremarkable. The kind of man who remembered your birthday and offered to fix your mailbox. He blended in so completely that even his own family saw only what he allowed them to see. That's the thing about control. It's not just about holding power, it's about perfecting invisibility. And Dennis Rader was becoming very, very good at that. He once said, allegedly, that his greatest skill was project planning. Not killing, not hunting. Planning. The boy who collected rules had grown into a man who wrote them. He wasn't the storm. He was the weather forecast. Calm, systematic, and terrifyingly accurate. Suburbia, Kansas, rows of pastel houses, mailboxes standing like soldiers, lawns so neat you could time your watch by the sprinklers. A world built on politeness and predictability. Dennis Rader fit in perfectly, almost too perfectly. He left the house each morning with a packed lunch, a clipboard, and the calm of a man who trusted the world to run on schedule. He worked for the city, checking meters, issuing compliance warnings, reminding citizens that order kept chaos away. People saw him as the local rule book in human form. He liked that. At church, he was dependable. He organized picnics, counted donations, volunteered to read scripture. His pastor once said he had the soul of a shepherd. He smiled at that, because he knew he was something else entirely. Neighbors remember him raking leaves with military precision, trimming hedges into perfect cubes, waving to kids on bikes. His wife, Paula, baked casseroles for potlucks. His children played in the yard. From a distance, they looked like an advertisement for decency. Inside, the ritual was relentless. Coffee measured to the gram, shirts ironed in numerical order, tools arranged by size. Even the garbage bins were labeled. He believed chaos was a moral failing. He fought it the way other men fought sin. But after the lights went out, the house changed temperature. He'd retreat to the basement, his sanctuary of control. There were lists taped to the wall, sketches, photographs clipped neatly into folders. He didn't think of it as darkness, he thought of it as administration. He wrote in a stiff, bureaucratic tone, Project A completed. Project B pending. To him, people weren't people. They were case studies in a private archive. He recorded everything. Timestamps, materials, lessons learned. He told himself he was learning efficiency. In truth, he was building mythology. Co-workers later said he could be strangely intense about small rules. He'd lecture a colleague for using the wrong form, then spend lunch alone, scribbling notes no one was allowed to read. One joke that he should have been a detective. Irony aged badly. Even his hobbies were about command. As a scout leader, he taught boys how to tie knots, how to read maps, how to stay calm when lost. They admired his patience. He admired their trust. On Sundays, he'd bow his head as the choir sang Amazing Grace. And somewhere in that bowed head, another voice whispered, You are grace. That's how deep the performance went. Psychologists later suggested that he didn't hide behind normality. He weaponized it. The uniform, the church badge, the civic job were all camouflage stitched together from society's blind spots. Everyone assumes that the man enforcing order must embody it. There were moments, even then, when the mask slipped. Tiny cracks invisible to most. A flash of irritation when plans changed. A neighbor's dog wandering too close to his property. The look in his eyes when someone disobeyed. Little sparks of fury quickly refiled under composure. In his mind, order and authority were one and the same. If you followed the rules, you were safe. If you didn't, you became an example. By the late 70s, the calm began to fracture. Routine no longer fed the hunger. He drove aimlessly through residential streets after work, memorizing schedules, curtains, window heights. He called them surveys. In reality, They were auditions. He'd return home, kiss his wife, wash his hands, and write. Always the lists, the charts, the checkboxes. Each entry a rehearsal for something he hadn't yet admitted aloud. His neighbors slept soundly, believing they lived beside reliability itself. The city trusted him with keys, codes, and clipboards. The church trusted him with souls. His family trusted him with love. He trusted no one, only his system. The perfect neighbor had perfected invisibility. And somewhere in that spotless house, the next project was already outlined, numbered, and waiting for execution. He called them projects, not murders, not attacks, projects, as if they were weekends of DIY, as if a human life could be scheduled, budgeted, and stapled into neat pages. That language tells you everything. The distance, the planning, the pride. It's hard to be monstrous when you speak like an accountant. What follows isn't a catalogue of gore. This is a map of method. The way he studied movement like choreography. How he turned fear into a timetable. How domination was practiced with the same care one uses when planning a picnic. You'll hear names, Otero, Bright, Fox, because they anchor the pattern. But we won't linger on the body. We'll look at what the acts reveal. Intent, ritual, control. He did reconnaissance like a field agent. He watched. He learned. People unwittingly rehearsed their endings for him by simply going about their days. He noted locks, lights, dogs, delivery schedules. He memorized which curtains were habitually closed and which bedroom windows were left slightly ajar. Everything was data. Everything was variable to control. There's a clinical rhythm to his work. It begins with selection, the choice of a house, a certain convenience in the way doors opened, or the privacy a yard afforded. Then the waiting, patient so long it becomes an art form. Then the approach, the execution of logistics, knots practiced until they were flawless, movements timed so that no noise should be audible from down the street. Afterwards came the documentation, notebooks where lessons learned were inked in a tone that might have been mistaken for office shorthand if you didn't know what the shorthand described. He didn't kill from disordered impulse. He didn't kill to shock. He killed to prove he could make the world obey his script. In his mind, the act was a demonstration of expertise, a demonstration of control over chaos. Where others sought adrenaline, he sought precision. Where others raged, he rehearsed. This is important. Control and sexuality were braided together in the most private corners of his psyche. The fantasies were not simply about harm, they were about absolute dominion. That dominion required not just violence, but an audience, real or imagined. In letters and calls to the press, which he crafted with that odd mix of clerical phrasing and theatrical flourish, he revealed a man who wanted to direct the narrative after the fact. He wanted spectators to see his choreography laid out, to respond not with panic, but with recognition. He wanted applause for his secrecy. The victims become variables in his experiments. Names like Otero, Bright, Fox are pulled into this pattern not as statistics, but as evidence of a method. Each incident sharpened his technique. Each mistake taught him how to be cleaner next time. That obsession with refinement is what distinguishes ritual from rampage. Ritual has rules. Rampage has only chaos. We should be careful with labels. Some accounts describe him as ritualistic, others clinical, others still as a man flattered by his own myth. Where sources disagree, we'll mark them allegedly. He allegedly kept souvenirs. He allegedly rehearsed entries and exits. Those are the sorts of claims that feed tabloids and true crime forums alike. They're sensational. and they're often messy. Our interest here is what the pattern suggests, not the most lurid rumour. One thing every investigator noted was his calm. Witnesses, where they exist, describe a man who moved through a room like a contractor moving through a job site. Efficient, methodical, unemotional. He was not a creature overtaken by rage or flash. He was a man putting a plan into practice. That distinction matters because it converts fear into system. System can be studied. System can be resisted if you see it. There is also the small, terrible domestication of evil to consider. The way ordinary objects, ropes, cameras, a roll of tape, became instruments in a private workshop. He treated them like tools in a maintenance closet, choosing ones that would leave the least trace, the ones that allowed him to tidy up after himself. This choice shows a mind less interested in spectacle than in survival. He wanted the act to be invisible until he chose to make it visible. What he left behind, besides grief and silence, was a trail of paperwork, reports, timelines, letters. He loved records. If you ever wanted to anger him, destroy his lists. In destroying a list, you remove order. That's perhaps why he created so many. They were scaffolds for a world where he could be the only builder and the only inspector. The psychology is cold, but not mystical. It is not a cinematic descent into madness. It reads more like an engineer's fascination. What can be controlled? What can be perfected? The danger of that thinking is it erases the other human beings involved. When a person becomes Project B, empathy is filed away. Dehumanization becomes clerical. And yet there is an odd theatricality to his communications. The letters and taunts were not merely bragging. They were invitations to watch. They suggest that he wanted not only to control the act, but to own the story that followed. That ownership thrilled him. It let him keep the final edit. It's a small, spiteful salesmanship. To be the author of your own infamy, rather than its incidental inhabitant. So, when you hear the names, Otero, Bright, Fox, hold onto the pattern rather than the horror you may imagine. The pattern tells us more about Dennis Rader than any single violent image could. It tells us that evil need not be chaotic to be monstrous. It tells us that boredom, when coupled with an appetite for control, can be remodeled into something devastatingly intentional. He didn't kill for chaos. He killed for choreography. And the choreography for him was everything. He liked the word project. It sounded clean, efficient. Each one was numbered, mapped, documented. The word murder never appeared in his notes. Only phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. In total, he murdered 10 people. His first victims that we know of were the Oteros. January 15th, 1974, Wichita. A quiet corner house, a cold morning, a family of 4. Joseph and Julie Otero, their 2 children, Joseph Jr. and Josie. Rader later told investigators he had chosen them almost at random after spotting Julie through a window on his daily route. What followed would become the blueprint for everything after. Forced entry, control, a sequence rehearsed to perfection. He left the house tidied, almost respectful. The Oteros' home was the birthplace of BTK. He vanished from the news for a while, but not from his own mind. That first project had been imperfect, he thought. Too messy, too emotional. He vowed to refine. April 4th, 1974, Catherine Bright, 21, college student. He followed her, observed her habits, waited for a quiet afternoon. Her brother Kevin came home unexpectedly and survived, severely injured. For Dennis, it was another failure, too loud, too visible. He later described it clinically. Logistical issues. Then came Shirley Vian, 1977. A mother of 3, home alone with her children. He improvised, locked the kids in a bathroom with toys to keep them safe. It sounds merciful until you realize what that calm efficiency really meant. He always planned for witnesses, just not living ones. The same year, Nancy Fox. He called her a challenge. He admired her independence. He cut her phone line, entered her home, performed his ritual. Then, days later, he called 911 himself. Calm, deliberate, voice steady. He gave the address. Just go check the house, he said. Control, even after the act. After Fox, he paused. Not because he felt guilt, but because life demanded appearances. He was now a family man, a church deacon, a scout leader. The pause wasn't moral, it was logistical. Marine Hedge, 1985. A neighbour. He attended church with her, smiled at her every Sunday. He called her Project 7. That night, he waited until late, entered quietly. Afterwards, he took her body to his church, posed it, photographed it beneath the altar. To him, that was art. To everyone else, it was the moment his mask slipped completely. If only anyone had seen it. Vicky Vegeler, 1986. He entered her home under the guise of a telephone technician. She fought back, brave, defiant. He left frustrated, yet proud of the performance. He took her driver's license as a trophy. Years later, that license would become a clue leading to his arrest. Then came silence. For nearly 5 years, Wichita forgot his name. Dolores Davis, 1991. He knew her house from his compliance roots. He called it a well-executed project. He parked blocks away, walked through the fields in the dark, executed every step exactly as written. When he came home, his family thought he'd been on a scout trip. He made breakfast for his children the next morning. 10 people, spread over 17 years. 10 lives, 10 files, 10 lessons in control. To the public, he had vanished. To himself, he'd perfected the formula. The boy who once collected rules had now built his own universe, one where every act of cruelty had its own checklist, and every life reduced to data. The timeline ends there, officially, but investigators suspect there were more. Unconfirmed cases, women gone missing, scenes with familiar signatures. When asked in court, he neither confirmed nor denied. He just smiled, as if enjoying the mystery. Some of those claims are allegedly true, others products of speculation. But the pattern fits too well to ignore. Each crime was a performance, each detail rehearsed. Even his mistakes became part of the legend. He didn't seek chaos, he built choreography. And when it was over, he went home, kissed his wife, and slept soundly beneath the same roof where his own children dreamed. When he stopped, the city relaxed. Wichita exhaled. No one knew that Dennis Rader had simply changed hobbies. Because even when he wasn't active, he was still writing. Letters, notes, sketches, codes. He filled notebooks the way others filled confessionals. He'd always believed that control wasn't complete until it was documented. The 1970s were fading into beige, but BTK had discovered something new. The thrill of authorship. He began to write to the world, anonymously of course, because what's the point of being brilliant in secret if nobody knows? His first letter arrived at a local TV station. It was handwritten, oddly formal, signed with 3 letters that would soon brand him forever. BTK. Inside were details only the killer could know, along with poetry that was neither poetic nor accidental. Lines lifted from old murder ballads, phrases of mock repentance, a kind of bureaucratic verse. He wanted the world to understand him, or at least to read him. He mailed similar letters to newspapers, sometimes including items from the crime scenes. He addressed them to reporters, detectives, even pastors. Each note was a performance, part confession, part script, part advertisement. In one message, he offered the police a choice of names for himself, as if they were collaborators in branding. He wrote about himself in the third person, referring to BTK as if he were a mythic figure he merely managed. It was almost comical. A middle-aged man role-playing as his own villain. But behind the theatrical flair was a deeper hunger. The city had moved on. He couldn't stand it. He wanted to exist again, to occupy the headlines that had forgotten him. So he started feeding the media breadcrumbs, just enough to keep the story breathing. Detectives collected these letters with careful hands. They debated whether the writer was genuine. The grammar was stilted, the tone oddly polite, like a man trying to sound educated. But the details checked out. He even enclosed a photograph and a poem about one of his victims, a grotesque parody of mourning. Some of his communications, allegedly, were left inside library books or dropped in public mailboxes, as if the act of placement itself mattered. He loved the ritual, sealing the envelope, addressing it in neat handwriting, knowing that somewhere a reporter would open it and flinch. To Rader, this was better than any crime scene. He didn't need to take life anymore. He could control the narrative. He studied news coverage, correcting journalists' mistakes in his next letters. He treated police speculation like a classroom quiz. He didn't care if they found him, not yet. He just wanted them to quote him correctly. This was the era before the internet, but Dennis Rader would have loved it. Social media would have been his cathedral. Likes, followers, outrage, all forms of attention, all confirmation that he still existed. Instead, he created his own primitive version, a pen, a typewriter, and the city as his captive audience. When the letters stopped in the late 70s, the case went cold again. But for him, the silence was never empty. He reread his correspondence, corrected grammar, annotated old press clippings. He believed he'd created something lasting, a myth wrapped in stationery. He once told investigators years later that he'd wanted to communicate his story. That phrase says everything. Even his confessions were performances, edited for clarity and tone. He wasn't just killing, he was curating. BTK, the murderer might have faded. BTK, the writer, the poet, the self-appointed archivist. That was eternal. And somewhere in a neat suburban office, a man in a city uniform typed reports by day, and wrote to the newspapers by night. Both jobs required attention to detail. Both made him feel powerful. Only one of them made him feel real. For most killers, the pattern ends with a cell door or a casket. For Dennis Rader, it ended with quiet. Not repentance, not reform. Just a kind of suburban hibernation. After Dolores Davis in 1991, BTK simply disappeared. Wichita slept soundly again. The headlines yellowed, the detectives retired, and the myth dissolved into rumor. He, however, was alive and thriving, watering his lawn, attending potlucks, giving safety lectures at church. To the world, he was the picture of redemption. To himself, he was just taking a professional break. He called it his inactive phase. That's how he described 13 years of silence, the way you might describe a gap in your resume. It wasn't guilt that kept him dormant. It was routine. He'd grown busy with PTA meetings, scout camping trips, and his new job as a compliance officer for Park City. He enforced rules, measured lawns, wrote tickets. He lived surrounded by order, his favorite drug. Every morning he shaved precisely at 6:30. He logged the mileage on his city truck. He noted weather conditions, water usage, and his colleagues' punctuality. He was an employee's nightmare and a bureaucrat's dream. Co-workers described him as by the book. That phrase should be on his tombstone. It's fitting for a man who saw life as paperwork. At home, he was quiet, predictable, occasionally stern. He helped his kids with school projects. He prayed before dinner. He even gave talks at church about community safety. He'd stand at the podium, explaining how to protect your home from intruders. A sermon in irony. People nodded, took notes. No one laughed. Psychologists later tried to explain this dormant period. Some said the responsibilities of family life restrained him. Others believed he still fantasized, that the axe simply moved from the physical to the mental realm. He didn't stop being BTK. He just became a more efficient one. Control was still there. It had just changed format. In his private notebooks, he recorded dreams and urges. He wrote mock police reports about projects that never happened. He clipped crime articles, underlined certain phrases, labeled folders with years. He liked the neatness of imaginary crimes. No mess, no evidence, no risk. Neighbors saw a man who mowed his lawn in perfect parallel lines. His wife saw a man who folded laundry like a soldier. His colleagues saw a man obsessed with order. No one saw the echo chamber inside his head, still humming with the same dark energy. The silence wasn't peace, it was pressure building, like steam beneath a lid. And then came the new millennium, a new world of technology, cameras, computers, digital footprints. Dennis Rader felt invisible again, and he didn't like it. New cases took the spotlight. New names stole his fame. He watched documentaries about other killers, muttering corrections to the screen. He thought about sending another letter, just one, to remind Wichita who he was. For 13 years, he managed to be everything society praised. Husband, father, citizen. He didn't drink, didn't cheat, didn't swear. He obeyed every law except the ones he wrote for himself. His daughter went off to college. His son joined the Navy. The house grew quieter. And the silence, the same silence that once protected him, began to itch. He missed the power. He missed the audience. He missed being known. That's the cruel thing about narcissism. It doesn't fade with age. It califies. And so, in 2004, the quiet man in the Park City uniform sat down at his computer and decided that the world had forgotten long enough. He'd give them something to remember. It started, as most bad ideas do, with a question he shouldn't have asked. In 2004, Dennis Rader decided it was time to remind Wichita that BTK was still alive, and still clever. He'd been invisible for 13 years, and invisibility, he'd learned, was overrated. The police had never caught him. The public had mostly forgotten him. That, to a narcissist, is the worst kind of death. So he began sending letters again, this time from a different world. Computers had replaced typewriters. Phones could take pictures. There was a new kind of fame to chase, and Rader wanted in. He started small. Postcards, word puzzles, coded notes sent to local TV stations. They arrived with the same stiff phrasing and grammar quirks detectives still remembered from the 70s. Inside one envelope, he'd even included a cereal box. A dark pun on cereal. He was still performing, still trying to be clever, like a magician who doesn't realize the audience has changed. The letters escalated, as they always did. He asked the police questions directly, like they were pen pals in a game only he understood. His most infamous query was typed neatly on church stationery. Can I communicate with floppy disk and not be traced to a computer? The police, sensing an opportunity, replied through the newspaper. They told him it would be safe. Of course they lied. He trusted them. That trust, not guilt, not evidence, would be his undoing. Rader mailed a purple 1.44 megabyte floppy disk to a local TV station. It contained a single document, innocuous at first glance, but hidden in the file's metadata was gold. A username, Dennis, and a location tag pointing straight to Christ Lutheran Church, Park City, Kansas. The digital trail led detectives to the church computer. A quick search confirmed that the congregation's president was Dennis Rader, a man who lived less than 15 minutes from several of the original crime scenes. Still, investigators needed proof. They collected a DNA sample from his daughter's medical records, legally obtained, quietly analyzed. The results were conclusive. The genes matched perfectly with the BTK evidence. And just like that, the man who had spent decades mastering physical stealth was undone by digital arrogance. When officers arrested him on February 25, 2005, he didn't fight. He looked genuinely surprised, as though technology had betrayed him personally. During interrogation, he seemed more disappointed than afraid. He asked, "How did you find me?" They told him. He blinked once and said, "Oh." That was it. The great criminal mastermind brought down by a file extension. In his mind, he'd been careful. He'd used church property, not his own computer. He'd erased the disk before mailing it. He'd done everything by the book. But the book was outdated. He didn't understand that the digital age had no sympathy for precision. His flaw wasn't sloppiness, it was pride. He still thought he was the smartest man in the room. Ironically, he'd asked the police for help catching himself. He trusted the system because he believed he was above it. That's the eternal downfall of the narcissist. They can imagine every outcome except failure. After the arrest, reporters swarmed his quiet neighborhood. The words church president and serial appeared in the same sentence for the first time. Neighbors wept. His congregation prayed. The city finally exhaled. Again. In court documents, the chain of events was summed up in one sterile line. Subject transmitted digital media to law enforcement, leading to positive identification. That's one way to describe the climax of a decades-long hunt. Another way is this. He wasn't caught by chance or confession. He was caught by curiosity, the need to be acknowledged. The same need that had driven every letter, every plan, every project. In the end, it wasn't the police who broke him. It was the one person he could never outsmart, himself. When they led him into the interrogation room, Dennis Rader looked like a man called in for a parking dispute. Buttoned shirt, polite smile, glasses perched neatly on his nose. He thanked the officers for the coffee. He even asked if they wanted him to start from the beginning. They said yes, and he did. What followed was one of the most unsettling monologues in modern criminal history. For more than 30 hours, Rader calmly recited his life's work as if he were reading a quarterly report. No tears, no hesitation. Each word chosen, each pause deliberate. He described his first project in detail, how he prepared, what he learned, what went wrong, what he corrected next time. It wasn't confession, it was presentation. He even apologized, occasionally, but not to the victims. to himself for mistakes in execution. When detectives asked him why, he offered a list. Factor X, compulsions, fantasies, a need for control. He treated motive like an algebra problem he'd already solved. He said he lived with two people inside him, one normal, one dark. The dark one won, he concluded, as if citing an election result. He drew diagrams, referenced old notes, corrected the officers when they mixed up dates. He seemed proud to finally share the syllabus of his secret education. Then came the press conference. Wichita gathered to see the monster they'd spent 30 years imagining. And there he was. A city inspector, a church leader, a man who looked like someone's uncle. He spoke to reporters as though giving a civic briefing. "I'm sorry for what I've done," he said. "I know society can't forgive me. I'm a creature of my own making." He spoke those words without a tremor. No flash of remorse, just the practiced rhythm of a man who'd rehearsed being tragic. In court, the performance continued. He waived his right to trial and entered a guilty plea, but not before narrating every crime, step by step, in front of a packed courtroom. Each victim, each sequence, described with surgical calm. At one point, the judge interrupted. "Mr. Rader, you're under no obligation to go into such detail." He smiled and said, "Well, you need to understand the full picture, sir." The gallery sat frozen. Some cried. Some left. He went on, unfazed. Prosecutors later said it was less a confession than a seminar, a performance for one last audience. His daughter Kerri watched from home. She said later that it was the moment she realized her father had never really existed. What she saw was a stranger wearing his face. When the sentence came, 10 consecutive life terms, he nodded politely, thanked the judge, and adjusted his glasses. That was the end of BTK, legally speaking, but spiritually, it was Act 1 of a new play. Because even in chains, he couldn't stop performing. He wrote letters from jail, complained about prison menus, sent fans autographs signed Dennis. He rated interviews, corrected documentaries. He monitored how history would remember him, as though he were his own publicist. In one note to an admirer, allegedly, he compared himself to a fisherman. "I caught them. Now the system caught me. Balance, balance. That word again." He always craved symmetry. Even his downfall had to fit the pattern. When the cameras left, when the courtroom emptied, what remained was an old man in a jumpsuit, a bureaucrat without a desk, a planner without projects. He'd finally lost control, but he still had his voice, and he intended to use it. When the news broke, Kerri Rawson was home in Michigan, living what she thought was an ordinary life. She was married, teaching Sunday school, planning for the future. The phone rang, a friend's voice, trembling. "Kerri, turn on the TV." She did, and there he was, her father, in handcuffs, surrounded by flashing lights and microphones. At first she thought it was a mistake, maybe identity theft, maybe a bad headline, but then she heard the words, BTK killer, Dennis Rader, arrested, and something inside her cracked in slow motion. The man who tucked her in at night, who'd kissed her forehead before bed, who taught her how to ride a bike and tie a knot, had spent her entire childhood balancing PTA meetings with murder. In interviews years later, she said the first days felt like grieving someone who hadn't died. Her father was alive, but everything about him had vanished. The memories, the warmth, the safety, all suddenly rewired into something grotesque. Every hug became evidence, every camping trip, A cover story. She didn't speak publicly for a long time. The media wanted her immediately. The daughter of a monster. The living witness to evil's domestic disguise. But she stayed silent, refusing to become part of her father's mythology. She'd written him letters at first. She wanted to understand. How do you separate the father from the murderer when they share the same handwriting? His replies were chilling in their normality. Polite, detached, filled with small talk. He wrote about meals, television, his blood pressure. Never about remorse. Never about the people he destroyed. In one letter, he reminded her to keep faith, as though faith had anything left to hold on to. Eventually, she stopped responding. When she finally did speak, years later, it wasn't to defend him. It was to reclaim her own life from the shadow he'd cast. Her book, her interviews, the Netflix series, they weren't about BTK. They were about survival. About how you stitch yourself back together after learning your entire childhood was built on lies. She visited him once in prison. She described it like entering a museum of grief, sterile, cold, fluorescent. He smiled when he saw her, almost proud, like a father greeting a child at graduation. He said he'd found God again, that he was doing fine. She sat there, frozen, trying to reconcile the man who had raised her with the monster, who'd narrated his crimes in open court. When the visit ended, she walked out into the Kansas sunlight and said she felt lighter, not because anything was healed, but because she finally understood. She didn't owe him forgiveness. Her story changed how people saw BTK. Before, he was the faceless suburban bogeyman, the church guy with a secret. After, he was the father who ruined his own family from within. Her courage humanized what his crimes had dehumanized. She still struggles, she says, with nightmares, panic, sudden flashes of memory. But she also speaks to others who live with inherited darkness, the families of killers, addicts, abusers, reminding them that you can carry blood without carrying blame. Dennis Rader created BTK to make himself unforgettable. His daughter, without ever meaning to, made him small. Because when she stood in front of cameras and said, "He's not special, he's sick. Stop mythologizing him," she dismantled the empire of control he'd spent decades building. The monster wanted to be remembered. His daughter made sure he'd be understood instead. The El Dorado Correctional Facility sits in the Kansas plains. Endless sky, razor wire glinting like a mirage. From above, it looks orderly, symmetrical, exactly the kind of place Dennis Rader might have designed himself. Except here, he isn't the one giving orders. He arrived in 2005 escorted by officers who knew his name better than they wanted to. Inmates whispered it too, testing the sound, BTK, like an urban legend that had suddenly walked through the gates. He didn't get special treatment. No cameras, no spotlight, no podium, just a small concrete cell, 8 by 10, with a bed, a desk, and a toilet that flushed too loudly. It should have felt like punishment, but in the beginning, it felt like structure. He liked the schedules, meals at 6, counts at 8, lights out at 10. He wrote letters. He filed grievances about the food. He catalogued daily routines like a man building a new project. Guards said he kept his cell immaculate. Books stacked by genre, toiletries aligned in straight rows, commissary receipts folded with precision. He introduced himself to staff as Dennis. When other inmates asked about his crimes, he corrected them on details. He still needed the last word. He read the Bible daily, highlighted verses about redemption, underlined words like discipline and obedience. He told prison chaplains he'd found peace through faith. but his letters told another story. He still wrote to fans, yes, he had fans, and allegedly flirted with journalists. He signed autographs with his inmate number, doodled logos for BTK Productions. He even drafted a book proposal titled The BTK Story, until prison officials confiscated the manuscript. For all his talk of remorse, he couldn't resist turning himself into a brand. He treated infamy like a second job. He corrected documentaries, annotated interviews, and kept track of how often his name appeared in the press. It was the same old pattern. Control the narrative, even when you can't control the world. But time, unlike the police, never lost track of him. His health declined. Diabetes, hypertension, the creeping erosion of age. His hands, once steady for knots and letters, began to tremble. His eyes dimmed. His memory too. Sometimes the guards found him talking to himself, sometimes praying, sometimes narrating. He'd describe his day aloud, as if still writing the story. Even in solitude, he needed an audience. Kerri stopped visiting. So did the reporters. The letters slowed. The spotlight dimmed. Eventually, BTK was reduced to a routine number on the prison log, one among hundreds. That, perhaps, was the cruelest punishment of all: irrelevance. In one rare interview, he said, "I still keep my mind busy. I do projects in here, mental ones." The statement was pure Rader, tidy, detached, and delusional. The projects were gone. The lists meaningless. The audience silent. All that remained was the echo of his own name bouncing off concrete walls. He lives there still, in a kind of self-made mausoleum of order. Every day perfectly measured, every night identical. A man once obsessed with control, now confined to a schedule that doesn't ask his opinion. Some guards say he's courteous, others say he's manipulative. Both are probably right. Because if there's one thing Dennis Rader never lost, it's the instinct to perform. When the lights go out in El Dorado, the halls fall silent, except for the faint scratch of a pen, somewhere down the block. The last man awake, still writing his own script, even as history edits him out. You'd think the story ended in 2005. A confession, a sentence, a man sealed off from the world. But monsters don't retire quietly. They linger in files, in whispers, in the uneasy feeling that the math doesn't quite add up. Even from his cell, Dennis Rader managed to haunt investigators, not through violence, but through correspondence. Letters written in his careful, almost clerical hand. Some of them read like journal entries, others like riddles, and a few contained hints. Hints that maybe there was more to tell. In 2023, cold case detectives in Oklahoma reopened the disappearance of Cynthia Dawn Kinney, a 16-year-old cheerleader who vanished from a laundromat in 1976. Her case had long been unsolved, until a sheriff noticed certain details that sounded familiar. The geography, the timing, the use of the word project in Rader's old journals. When investigators searched a property once connected to him, they found sketches, crude, coded, eerie. Some appeared to depict scenes that matched unsolved crimes. He had labeled them with initials and dates, as if he were drafting blueprints. One page simply read, "Bad Wash Day, 1976. Allegedly, of course, none of it has been proven. But it was enough to make the world shiver again. Detective Laurie Fulbright, one of the officers who revisited the BTK files, described the process as chasing ghosts through paperwork. Old evidence boxes, faded Polaroids, cryptic notes in a handwriting that never lost its precision. Every line had to be weighed. Was this fact, fantasy, or manipulation? Because Rader loved to blur the line. He once said in a prison interview, "People think they know me. They don't. I still have secrets." It was pure bait, a hook tossed into the waters of his own legend. But the truth is, the new investigators aren't sure what's real anymore. He might have drawn those sketches to feed his ego. Or he might be hinting at something genuine. In the world of BTK, performance and confession are identical twins. The renewed interest brought him something he hadn't had in years: attention. He started writing again, letters to journalists, to criminologists, to anyone who'd listen. He offered insight into his crimes, suggested new interpretations of his old work, always polite, always formal, always in control of the story, or trying to be. His daughter, meanwhile, had to relive everything. She gave interviews, urging the public to focus on the victims, not her father's games. "Don't let him control the narrative again," she said. She knows him better than anyone. The man who will twist empathy into a stage light. In one of his more recent letters, Rader complained about health issues, about being ignored. He hinted that he might reveal more if people would just show him some respect. That's how narcissism ages. It bargains. To this day, investigators believe he may have had access or opportunity in other disappearances, though nothing has been confirmed. Forensic teams have searched sites in Kansas and Oklahoma. Abandoned barns, old wells, creek beds, looking for traces that might link him to more than the 10 he admitted. So far, no conclusive evidence, just the echo of possibility. Still, the idea persists that BTK wasn't just a killer, but a collector of myths, leaving riddles behind so his name could never fully die. It's the kind of arrogance that makes closure impossible. One detective put it simply, "He's still playing the same game, only now he plays it with us." And maybe that's the point. For Rader, attention was always the currency. Even in isolation, he spends it carefully, one letter at a time. By the time Dennis Rader stopped speaking, the world had already written its own ending for him. No redemption arcs, no poetic justice. Just an aging man in a cell, talking to himself, and a culture still trying to understand how someone so ordinary could house so much horror. Because that's what makes BTK so disturbing. He wasn't cinematic. He wasn't charismatic. He was painfully, devastatingly normal. A husband who barbecued with the neighbors. A father who worried about his daughter's grades. A church deacon who lectured about morality on Sundays and planned murders on Mondays. He shattered the comforting illusion that monsters look like monsters. That's his real legacy, the death of our certainty. The realization that the man mowing his lawn next door might have entire worlds of violence hiding behind his smile. For criminologists, he became a case study in controlled psychopathy. A man who could compartmentalize so completely that guilt became irrelevant. For psychologists, he was proof that narcissism, unchecked and coddled by religion and routine, could mutate into something lethal. And for the rest of us, he's the story you tell yourself when you double-check the lock before bed. His daughter, Kerri Rawson, said it best. "He's not special. He's sick. Stop mythologizing him." That one sentence undid decades of sensationalism. Because what she understood, and what he never could, was that myth is mercy. It lets us believe evil is rare, spectacular, cinematic. The truth is much worse. Evil can be polite. It can be punctual. It can pay its taxes and hold the door open for you. That's why BTK still unnerves people more than any movie villain. He didn't kill because of childhood trauma or mental illness. He killed because he wanted to, and because he could. And when he couldn't anymore, he wrote about it. Today, his story lives on in documentaries, podcasts, Netflix specials, each one dissecting the same pattern, the same pathology, the same question that never finds a satisfying answer. Why? There isn't one. There never was. He wasn't a genius. He wasn't possessed. He wasn't even particularly interesting. He was a bored, meticulous man who confused control with meaning and mistook fear for legacy. The fascination will fade. It always does. But the echo of him, the quiet horror of the suburbs, the fear that evil might wear a wedding ring, that will linger. Because BTK didn't just terrorize the city. He forced us to look directly at the fragile line between decency and delusion, and to admit how thin it really is. When he dies, his name will fade from headlines. His letters will yellow in evidence boxes. His notebooks will gather dust in some archive. But the unease he left behind, that quiet suburban dread, will survive him. Maybe that's the truest punishment. Not hellfire, not fame, just being remembered as proof that evil can look like a man who waves from his driveway. And that was the story of Dennis Rader, the man who proved that sometimes evil wears a clean shirt and mows the lawn on Sundays. If you made it this far, you probably need a deep breath, maybe a cup of tea, or a background check on your neighbors. But before you disappear into the algorithmic void, do us a small favor. If you like this story, or at least appreciate the fact that we survived telling it, hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. It keeps this strange little storytelling corner alive in a world that prefers dance videos to dark history. And if you've got theories, thoughts, or just want to drop a single emoji of existential dread, leave it in the comments. We read them all. Yes, even the weird ones. You can also help us keep Napmax independent over at ko-fi.com/napmax, where every coffee, ghost emoji, or mysterious midnight donation helps us keep creating stories. YouTube doesn't exactly promote. So until next time, lock your doors, trust your gut, and remember, the quiet ones aren't always harmless. This is Napmax Stories, and you've been listening to BTK, the Perfect Neighbor. Sleep easy if you can.